I'm Zoe Hall, and I learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to earn respect is to demand it. Let me tell you about the day I finally drew the line. After our Thanksgiving dinner, my father-in-law Victor was handing out holiday money to all the grandchildren, crisp $100 bills for each child. When he reached my daughter Lydia, his hand suddenly pulled back. "I don't really know this child," he said, his voice cutting through the warm holiday atmosphere like ice. "Don't know her." My daughter had been calling him Grandpa for 4 whole years. At every family gathering, she was the first to fetch his slippers, always eager to help him change the television channels. She brought him his reading glasses when he misplaced them, and she never forgot to wish him good morning when she came downstairs for breakfast. But because she was the child I brought into this marriage from my previous relationship, he had never truly acknowledged her presence, never given her the affection a grandfather should show. My sister-in-law Jade seized the moment to add fuel to the fire, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Don't blame Dad too much, Zoe. After all, Lydia isn't a boy, and you know how traditional families value male heirs." Her words stung with their casual cruelty, as if my daughter's worth could be measured by her gender and bloodline. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Share your advice below and subscribe to see how my story continues. And then, I made a decision that changed everything. I forced a smile and nodded, pretending to understand, swallowing the bitterness that rose in my throat. That evening, Victor was practically bouncing with excitement as he outlined his elaborate vacation plans for our family trip to Florida. "Zoe," he said, rubbing his hands together with anticipation, "how many bedrooms does that oceanfront vacation rental you booked in Miami have? I want to make sure everyone has enough space to spread out and really enjoy ourselves." Without looking up from my magazine, I replied in a voice as calm as still water, "I cancelled it." The entire living room fell into a silence so complete, it seemed to swallow sound itself. The crystal chandelier that had hung in that room for over a decade cast its dim, amber light like old candle wax that had hardened and yellowed with age. The very air around us seemed to freeze the moment those 2 words left my lips. Victor's face went through a series of transformations that would have been comical if they weren't so telling. His smile, which had been wide and expectant just moments before, became rigid and unnatural. The age spots on his weathered face seemed to stand out more prominently as his muscles twitched with shock and disbelief. It was as if someone had slapped him across the face in front of the entire family, and he couldn't quite process what had just happened. His hand, which had been gesturing enthusiastically about room arrangements, froze awkwardly in mid-air. "What did you say?" His voice came out dry and scratchy, filled with incredulity. He leaned forward slightly, as if he hadn't heard me correctly, and needed confirmation of what seemed impossible to him. I raised my eyes from the magazine and looked directly at him, my gaze steady and unwavering. With deliberate clarity, I repeated my statement. I said I cancelled the Miami oceanfront vacation rental. The booking is no longer valid. "How dare you!" Victor's fist came down on the walnut coffee table with such force that the remaining coffee in his cup splashed over the rim, creating an embarrassing puddle that spread across the polished surface. His entire body seemed to transform into that of an aging, enraged lion whose territory had been challenged. The veins in his neck bulged prominently as his face turned various shades of red and purple. "Zoe, this is completely disrespectful. You're humiliating our entire family." His voice thundered through the room, but I remained completely unmoved by his theatrical display of outrage. I sat there quietly, watching his performance with a detached sense of observation. Inside, I felt no emotional turbulence whatsoever. If anything, I found the entire spectacle somewhat absurd and even mildly amusing. Here was a man lecturing me about respect and family honor, yet just hours earlier, he had demonstrated the exact opposite of those values. When he had stood there holding that crisp new $100 bill, deliberately passing over my daughter Lydia's outstretched hand, her small fingers reaching hopefully for what every other grandchild had received. Where was his respect then? The moment he uttered those 6 devastating words about not knowing my child, I watched the light in Lydia's eyes die instantly. That image burned in my memory like a red-hot brand pressed against my heart. In that moment of casual cruelty, where was his concern for family honor and dignity? "Sister, you're being far too impulsive about this," Jade chimed in, crossing her legs with deliberate casualness as she examined her freshly manicured nails. Her voice carried that particular tone of false concern that people use when they want to appear reasonable while delivering criticism. That vacation rental must cost several $100s per night. Throwing away thousands of dollars just like that shows you really have money to burn, she continued, pausing to glance up at me with a look that mixed mockery with calculation. Unlike the rest of us who have to depend on Dad's Social Security to get by. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. Depending on Social Security, then how exactly had she afforded that $300 designer sweater she was currently wearing? How did she manage to upgrade to the latest iPhone model every few months? These purchases certainly weren't covered by government assistance. Ever since I had established myself in a stable, well-paying career, this family had grown accustomed to my financial contributions as if they were an entitlement rather than a generous gesture. They had developed the comfortable habit of treating me like an automatic source of funding while simultaneously taking my blood, sweat, and tears completely for granted. "Zoe, you need to go apologize to Dad right now." My husband Ryan finally emerged from his stunned silence. He walked over to where I was sitting and gently tugged at my sleeve, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a soothing whisper. "Dad's getting older, and you know how his temper can be. If you just humor him a little bit, this whole thing will blow over and we can all move on." I turned to look at this man I had chosen to spend the rest of my life with, the person I had trusted with my heart and my future. His face displayed a mixture of anxiety and helplessness, the classic expression of someone caught between conflicting loyalties. I used to find his gentle, peacekeeping nature endearing, believing it showed kindness and wisdom. Now, however, I saw it for what it really was: cowardice disguised as diplomacy. "Humor him." My voice was soft, but every word was clearly audible in the tense silence of the room. "Ryan, he humiliated my daughter, our daughter. I know, I understand completely, but..." He fumbled for words, desperately trying to find some middle ground that would satisfy everyone. "Dad doesn't mean it maliciously, he just has old-fashioned ideas and it's hard for someone his age to change their way of thinking." "I'm willing to apologize," I interrupted him, speaking each word with crystal-clear precision so there could be no misunderstanding. "But only after Victor Hall personally apologizes to my daughter Lydia for the humiliation he subjected her to today." Ryan's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. He understood, just as I did, that what I was asking for was essentially impossible. Getting that stubborn, pride-filled old man to admit wrongdoing and lower himself to apologize would be more difficult than reaching the moon. The chaos in the living room continued to swirl around me. Victor's angry shouting mixed with Jade's snide commentary, creating a cacophony that buzzed in my ears like a swarm of annoying flies. I had heard enough. Without another word, I stood up and walked to Lydia's bedroom. My daughter was already asleep, her small body curled up beneath her colorful quilt. Her long eyelashes still showed traces of the tears she had shed earlier, and my heart ached seeing the evidence of her pain. Throughout the entire ordeal, she had been remarkably well behaved, Even after being publicly humiliated, she hadn't thrown a tantrum or created a scene. She had simply retreated quietly to her room to process her hurt in private. But I knew how deeply wounded she must have felt inside. I leaned down and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, feeling my heart constrict as if it were soaking in ice-cold salt water. The sensation was both sour and swollen with pain. Walking to her bedroom door, I carefully closed it behind me with the softest possible click. That small sound seemed to create a barrier between us and all the ugliness and arguments happening on the other side. From that moment forward, I knew that this house, this family dynamic, would never be the same again. The next morning, the atmosphere around the breakfast table was frigid enough to freeze water. Victor sat in his usual position at the head of the table, but his coffee remained completely untouched. His weathered face was set in such a deep scowl that it seemed to extend deeper than the deepest ocean trench. He was conducting a silent protest, maintaining the posture of someone who had suffered a tremendous injustice while waiting for me to come crawling back with an apology. Jade had taken her passive-aggressive behavior to the next level by refusing to even come down to the dining room, presumably because the sight of my face might ruin her appetite. Ryan sat with a glass of orange juice that he sipped absent-mindedly, while his eyes darted nervously between his father and me, his brow furrowed with worry and confusion. "Zoe." He finally couldn't contain himself any longer and leaned over to speak in what he thought was a confidential whisper. "Dad has high blood pressure and he was upset all night long. Now he's not eating breakfast either. If he gets so worked up that it affects his health." He didn't finish the sentence, but his meaning was perfectly clear. Here it was again, the same old emotional manipulation. He was using his father's health as a weapon to suppress my legitimate grievances and justified anger. Instead of responding to his guilt trip, I calmly reached for my phone. Right there in front of him, I opened a travel booking application and deliberately typed Florida 5-star hotels into the search bar. The screen immediately filled with images of luxurious, gold-plated hotel lobbies and suites, each with price tags that seemed to glow with expensive promise. I slid the phone across the table so it was directly in front of him. The plane tickets to Florida were purchased at a special discount rate, I said in the same tone I might use to discuss the weather forecast. "Since they're non-refundable, you're all welcome to book your own hotel accommodations and enjoy your vacation." I watched Ryan's face cycle through a complex series of expressions before delivering my final statement. "And you don't need to worry about paying me back for the tickets. Consider them my gift to you." Ryan's lips moved soundlessly, unable to form any coherent response. My words, while appearing generous on the surface, were actually the most devastating blow I could have delivered. I had effectively kicked all their problems back into their own court. I was intimately familiar with the Hall family's financial situation. Victor's Social Security payments barely covered basic monthly expenses. Jade was a textbook case of someone who spent every penny she earned without any savings whatsoever. Ryan's salary was almost entirely consumed by the mortgage payments on our current house. This family's quality of life had only improved dramatically after I married into it and began contributing my income. Expecting them to cover the cost of a 5-star hotel vacation with their own resources was absolutely laughable. If they wanted to go, their only option would be to stay in some $100 per night roadside motel. The contrast between what I had originally planned as a luxury family getaway and what they could now afford, a senior citizen budget adventure, was stark enough to leave both the status-conscious Victor and the materialistic Jade feeling completely defeated. If they went, they would be embarrassed by the downgrade. If they didn't go, those non-refundable plane tickets would be a constant reminder of wasted money. Either choice was painful. Sure enough, when Ryan relayed my message to his father, Victor's complexion shifted from iron grey to a deep purple. His lips trembled with rage as he pointed an accusing finger at me, but for several long moments he was completely speechless. He clearly hadn't anticipated that his usually compliant daughter-in-law would employ such a scorched earth strategy against him. I ignored their continuing drama and finished my breakfast at a leisurely pace before heading to my bedroom to prepare for work. As I reached the doorway, I could hear Jade's shrill voice echoing from the living room. "Dad! Ryan! Look at this! Even the cheapest hotels in Florida cost over $300 per night. Where are we supposed to get that kind of money?" This was immediately followed by Victor's furious shouting, "Forget it! We're not going anywhere!" A barely perceptible smile played at the corners of my mouth. This ridiculous drama was ending exactly as I had predicted it would, with a fittingly absurd conclusion. I felt no sense of victory or triumph, only a vast, empty calm that bordered on amusement. They had believed they held all the power over me, not realizing that when a mother decides to protect her child, she can become more formidable than any opponent they might face. After the Florida vacation fell through, the resentment in our house accumulated like moldy storm clouds, pressing down on everyone with its heavy, oppressive weight. Victor abandoned his hunger strike protest, but he found new and creative ways to make life miserable for the entire household. He would deliberately track mud through the house with his dirty shoes whenever I was mopping the floors. When I was on important work calls, he would turn the television volume to maximum. He expressed his displeasure through these petty, vindictive actions that revealed the emotional maturity of a spoiled child. I maintained my policy of complete indifference. He was behaving like an overgrown toddler, throwing a tantrum because he couldn't get his way. The more attention you give to such behavior, the more it escalates. I thought my strategy of ignoring him would eventually cause this nonsense to die down, but I underestimated both the stubbornness and the malice of a bitter old man. That afternoon, I left work early to take Lydia to her beloved art class. The moment I walked through our front door, I heard my daughter's heartbreaking sobs echoing through the house. Those cries cut through me like a dull knife, slicing away at my heart with each agonized sound. I rushed into the living room and was confronted by a scene that made my blood freeze in my veins instantly. Lydia was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by scattered pieces of colorful wood and metal. These fragments were all that remained of the Swiss music box her deceased biological father had left her, the only tangible connection she had to his memory. The music box had featured a delicate ballerina in a pink tutu on top, and it was Lydia's most treasured possession. Now that little ballerina lay in pieces. Her head had been severed from her body, and her torso was cracked into several fragments. Victor stood nearby, still holding a feather duster in his hand, showing absolutely no signs of remorse or guilt on his weathered face. "It was an accident," he said dismissively, his tone filled with irritation and contempt. "I bumped into it while cleaning. It's just a worthless old toy anyway. Stop that crying. It's giving me a headache. I'll buy you a new one later, an electronic one that's 100 times better than this piece of junk." Lydia's sobbing intensified. Between her tears, she was desperately trying to fit the broken pieces back together with her small hands. The sharp edges of the wood had cut her delicate fingers, and tiny drops of blood were beginning to form, but she seemed oblivious to the physical pain. This child, who was normally so well-behaved and understanding, was experiencing her first complete emotional breakdown. I walked slowly across the room and knelt down beside my daughter, gathering her trembling form into my arms. She shook against me as she struggled to catch her breath between sobs. "Mommy, Daddy's gift. It's gone forever," she whispered through her tears. My eyes felt dry and scratchy, but I couldn't produce a single tear. I stared at the scattered fragments on the floor, then up at Victor's completely unapologetic face. In that moment, the last remnants of any warmth or affection I had ever felt for this family were crushed into dust and blown away. This wasn't an accident. I knew it with absolute certainty. That music box had always been kept in the most protected corner of the entertainment center, far from any normal cleaning activities. How could he have accidentally knocked it over during routine housework? This was deliberate. This was his way of getting revenge against me by destroying the thing my daughter valued most. He wasn't content with simply rejecting her place in this family. He wanted to erase every trace of her past, every connection to her original father. This man was not an elder deserving of respect. He was an executioner, slowly torturing my daughter's spirit with the cruelest possible methods. I held Lydia close, gently stroking her hair as I felt her small body convulse with grief. My own rage was like molten lava building pressure deep underground, threatening to explode through my chest and out of my throat, but I maintained my control. Instead, I raised my head and fixed Victor with a gaze so cold it could have frozen fire. He shifted uncomfortably under my stare, muttering more pathetic excuses. "What are you looking at? I told you I didn't break it on purpose. The thing just fell down by itself." I didn't waste energy arguing with him. There's no point in debating with someone who operates without integrity or honesty. In my mind, I was quietly writing the final sentence in the story of my relationship with this so-called family. Without saying a word, I helped my daughter to her room and comforted her until she stopped crying. Then I returned to the living room with a small box and, in full view of Victor, began carefully collecting every single fragment of the destroyed music box. I moved slowly and gently, handling each piece as if it were made of precious gems. Victor stood watching me, his face cycling from red to white as he seemed to sense that something ominous was building beneath my eerily calm exterior. After I had gathered every last splinter and closed the lid of the box, I stood up and looked directly at each person in the room. Ryan and Jade had returned home at some point and were standing in the hallway, staring at the scene with confused expressions. "We're moving out," I announced. My voice wasn't loud, but in the deathly quiet of the living room, it struck like thunder. "What?" Ryan was the first to react, rushing over to me with his face displaying shock and bewilderment. "Moving out? Why? We agreed we were going to save money for a house in a good school district for Lydia's education." A good school district. I looked at him and felt a wave of bitter irony wash over me. My daughter can't even get basic respect and safety in this house. What good would the best school district in the world do her? My gaze shifted to Victor, and my voice took on the sharpness of ice. Should she learn how to silently endure humiliation? Or should she learn how to watch her most precious belongings get destroyed bit by bit? Ryan was left speechless by my questions. Pain and internal conflict played across his features, but he still tried to salvage the situation. "Zoe, please don't be hasty. Dad didn't mean... That really was just an accident." Enough. I was done listening to his weak, meaningless explanations. This man disappointed me more every time he opened his mouth. My heart had already died completely. I looked at him, then at his father and sister standing behind him. The expressions on their faces showed a combination of dependency and a desire to control me, and it made me feel physically sick. So I dropped my final bombshell. "The money for the house is coming from my pre-marriage savings. I'm buying the property myself. Your family doesn't need to contribute a single penny." This statement hit the room like lightning, shattering the false peace that had been holding this household together. I watched Victor's and Jade's faces collapse in real time. They were shocked, panicked, and unable to believe what they were hearing. They had always assumed that I needed to depend on Ryan and this family to survive in this city. They thought that by controlling the housing situation, they controlled my destiny and my choices. They were completely wrong. I had never been a parasitic vine that needed to attach itself to someone else to thrive. I was a tree with my own roots, capable of growing and flourishing independently. I didn't need to depend on anyone. Zoe! You've completely lost your mind. Victor was shaking with fury, his pointing finger trembling in the air. I ignored his outburst entirely. Carrying the box containing the fragments of the music box, I returned to my room and closed the door firmly behind me. Once you declare war, there's no turning back. The real battle was just beginning. When I set my mind to something, I follow through completely. The very next day, I started contacting real estate agents through various property apps on my phone. I made call after call, and my weekend schedule became packed with house hunting appointments. My decisive action sent the clearest possible message to this household. I was no longer the quietly supportive daughter-in-law who managed everything behind the scenes. I began establishing clear boundaries in all aspects of our shared life. First, I stopped contributing to household expenses. I no longer automatically paid the utility bills or transferred money into the family's shared account for groceries and incidentals. Victor was the first to notice the change. He was a devoted sports fan who spent most of his free time planted in front of the television watching games and matches. That evening, he prepared his usual cup of hot tea, put on his reading glasses, and settled in to watch an important football playoff game. But when he flipped through all the sports channels, every single screen displayed the same message. Your subscription has expired. Please renew to continue watching. What's going on? He shouted toward the living room. Why isn't the TV working? Ryan went over and fiddled with the remote for several minutes before giving up. Dad, the sports package subscription ran out. Victor immediately turned his frustration toward me. Zoe, how could you let this happen? You forgot to renew the subscription. I was sitting on the couch, browsing property listings on my tablet, and didn't even look up when he started complaining. Sorry about that, Dad, I replied with just the right touch of apologetic tone. I've been so busy looking at houses that it slipped my mind. I paused and lifted my head, giving him an innocent smile. Since we'll be moving out soon anyway, you and Ryan will need to handle these household bills yourselves going forward. If you want to watch sports, you'll need to have Ryan renew the subscription. Victor's face instantly turned the color of a ripe plum. A monthly sports package didn't cost much money, but the symbolic meaning of this action was devastating to his sense of control. It meant he was losing his authority over the household's resources and decisions. Next was Jade's turn to feel the impact. She had grown accustomed to the imported blueberries and trendy snacks I brought home every week from the upscale grocery stores. This week, the refrigerator's snack section remained completely empty. She opened the refrigerator door, looked inside, then slammed it shut with unnecessary force. In a pointed comment directed at her mother, she said, "Mum, there isn't even a piece of fruit in this house. We're really living like paupers now. My mother-in-law." Helen glanced at me with an expression that suggested she wanted to say something but didn't dare. I acted as if I hadn't heard anything and continued focusing on my tablet. These small but persistent economic adjustments were like thousands of tiny needles, pricking every corner of this household's comfort. There were no loud arguments or dramatic confrontations, but I knew that this visible decline in their standard of living was giving them their first real taste of what financial pressure felt like. For the first time, they were beginning to understand that I, the outsider they looked down upon, had actually been the foundation supporting their comfortable lifestyle all along. Now that foundation was preparing to walk away, and their entire world was about to collapse. Ryan finally reached his breaking point. The oppressive atmosphere in the house, combined with his family's increasing resentment and my complete indifference to it all, was making him miserable. That night, after Lydia had gone to bed, he came into my room for the first time in weeks, looking more exhausted and defeated than I had ever seen him. Instead of launching into his usual speeches about his father's age or asking me to be more understanding, he sat down in the chair across from my desk and remained silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and barely above a whisper. "Zoe, can we talk?" I didn't cry, and I didn't get angry. My heart had become hard and calm through all the disappointments I had endured. I closed my laptop and looked at him directly. "Talk about what? Your father's high blood pressure or your sister's snack budget?" My words were delivered calmly but carried sharp edges. Ryan's face went pale, and he buried his head in his hands, his fingers clawing through his hair in frustration. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I was completely wrong." I waited for him to continue. When he raised his head again, his eyes were bloodshot with shame and regret that seemed to be eating him alive. "Today, I finally went through everything that's happened, from the very beginning." His voice was low, as if he were confessing his sins to me and sitting in judgment of himself at the same time. "I remembered when we first got married, and Lydia drew a picture of our whole family. She was so excited to show it to you, and you put it on the refrigerator. The next day, Jade had used it as a placemat for her takeout containers, and it was covered with grease stains. I remembered last month's family dinner, when Dad kept serving lobster to my nephew Tom, but when Lydia reached for some with her fork, Dad moved the platter away and said too much seafood wasn't good for children. I remembered how every time you bought things for this house, from rice and flour to clothes and shoes for them, they accepted everything as if it were their natural right, but none of them ever asked if you were working too hard. And then there was the holiday money, and that music box. Every incident he recounted had once been like a small thorn lodged in my heart. I thought I had become numb to these slights, but hearing him list them one by one made my eyes begin to sting with unshed tears. These weren't minor issues. They were 1,000 cuts delivered day after day that had slowly bled all my hopes for this family dry. I kept thinking that if I could just mediate between everyone, keep the peace, smooth things over, then our household could remain harmonious. Ryan's voice was thick with tears he was trying not to shed. "I was such a fool. I was so focused on avoiding conflict that I never considered how much damage my peacemaking was doing to you and Lydia." He stood up and walked over to me, then bowed formally from the waist. "Zoe, I'm sorry. From now on, I will stand with you. No matter what happens, I will stand with you." I looked into his red, swollen eyes and saw a man who had finally broken free from the shell of misguided family loyalty and weakness. For the first time in our 4 years of marriage, I was seeing the strength and responsibility that a husband and father should possess. In my heart, that frozen lake of emotions seemed to develop the tiniest crack. Our relationship's transformation was soon put to its first public test. Ryan's cousin was getting married, and according to their family's traditions, the entire extended clan was expected to contribute to an appropriately impressive wedding gift. Victor naturally assigned this task to Ryan, expecting him to request the money from me. "Tell Zoe that for your cousin's wedding, our family can't lose face. We need to contribute at least $1,000. Victor announced at the dinner table, speaking as if I weren't sitting right there. His tone suggested I was the family's personal ATM rather than his daughter-in-law. Ryan's face showed embarrassment, and he glanced at me, about to speak, but I beat him to it, smiling pleasantly as I responded. Dad, you don't need to go through Ryan for this. I reached into my purse and pulled out a red envelope I had prepared earlier, placing it on the table. Your cousin's wedding is a joyous occasion, and we absolutely want to show our support. Victor's face lit up with smug satisfaction, assuming I was capitulating as usual. Jade rolled her eyes with a, "Finally, you're being sensible" expression. Then I picked up a pen and, in full view of everyone at the table, carefully wrote 2 names on the back of the envelope, Zoe Hall and Lydia Hall. I slid the envelope toward Victor, maintaining my perfectly pleasant smile. Dad, since you said that our Lydia is unfamiliar to the Hall family, I figured she and I don't really count as part of your extended clan anyway. My voice remained conversational, but each word landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward. Every eye in the room focused on that envelope and the 2 names written on it. From now on, when it comes to family obligations like this, we'll handle our own social responsibilities. That way you won't have to struggle with whether we really count as family or not. My logic was flawless and my reasoning unassailable. I was simply applying the rules he had established when he rejected my daughter. This approach was far more devastating than any argument could have been. Victor's expression transformed from smugness to shock to humiliated rage in a matter of seconds. In front of all these relatives, I had used his own words against him with surgical precision. He wanted to explode with anger, but my statement was so logically sound that he couldn't find any weakness to attack. He had tried to maintain his authority as the family patriarch, but I had just publicly announced that my daughter and I were outside his jurisdiction, making his entire power structure look ridiculous. His face turned purple as he pointed at me, stammering, you, for several seconds without being able to form a complete sentence. All the relatives' expressions became uncomfortable, and whispered conversations began buzzing around the room. At that crucial moment, Ryan stood up. He didn't try to calm me down, and he didn't rush to soothe his father's wounded pride. He simply walked to my side, picked up the envelope with the 2 names I had written, and said calmly to Victor, "Dad, Zoe is right. From now on, our immediate family will handle our own gift obligations." Then he took my hand and squeezed it firmly. The warmth of his palm was solid and reassuring. I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and for the first time I saw complete support and understanding in his eyes. I knew that from this moment forward, I would no longer be fighting this battle alone. Victor stared at our joined hands, then slowly sank back into his chair like a defeated rooster, his face grey with the shame of public humiliation. My house hunting process moved forward with remarkable efficiency. Perhaps my desire to escape that toxic environment was so strong that it energized every aspect of the search. Within just 1 week, I had found and secured a property. It wasn't enormous, just a 900 square foot 2-bedroom apartment, but it had a south-facing balcony that would be perfect for plants, and both the elementary and middle schools in the district had excellent reputations. Most importantly, it belonged entirely to me. I didn't touch any of the savings Ryan and I had accumulated together. Instead, I used my personal work savings, combined with a credit line I qualified for individually, to pay the full purchase price in cash. The paperwork, contracts, and legal processes moved seamlessly from start to finish. I didn't inform anyone in the Hall family about these activities in advance, including Ryan. I needed to make this statement of complete independence in exactly this way. The day I received the deed to the property, the sunshine was particularly beautiful. I sat on the window seat in my new home, looking at the document with Zoe Hall printed clearly as the sole owner, and felt a joy and security I had never experienced before. This wasn't just a house, it was my confidence, my foundation, the fortress where my daughter and I could build our future. That evening, I returned to the oppressive environment I still had to call home temporarily. I placed a photocopy of the property deed in the center of the dining table, where it couldn't be missed. Victor and Helen were watching television, Jade was absorbed in her phone, and Ryan was preparing dinner in the kitchen. That single sheet of paper immediately captured everyone's attention. "What is this?" Helen asked first, reaching for the document. Victor picked up the copy, put on his reading glasses, and took one look before his pupils contracted sharply. "A property deed," he read aloud, then his gaze fixed on the owner section as if the paper had burned him. There, printed clearly, was my name alone. Zoe Hall. Only my name, no one else's. The living room fell into absolute silence. Jade grabbed the paper from him and stared at it, her mouth falling open. You bought a house? With cash? By yourself?" Ryan emerged from the kitchen, and when he saw the deed, the shock in his eyes slowly transformed into understanding and acceptance. "We're moving next weekend," I announced matter-of-factly. Victor and Helen were completely stunned. They stared at that piece of paper, then at me, with expressions of total disbelief. They had always assumed that housing was their ultimate leverage over me. In this expensive city, a woman with a child and no property was essentially rootless. They had been certain I wouldn't dare and couldn't possibly leave this family. But now I was showing them, in the most direct way possible, that not only did I dare to leave, but I could also create a better life for myself and my daughter entirely through my own efforts. Their final source of control, the invisible chain they had used to manipulate me, had been severed completely by my own hands. Helen's lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Victor, for the first time in his life, showed something close to panic on his always authoritative face. He realized he had lost every single tool he had used to control me. This house, this kingdom he had built and ruled over, was about to crumble. When Victor and Helen finally understood that their money source was really going to take her resources and leave, they panicked completely. The economic foundation that had supported their comfortable lifestyle was about to disappear forever, so they began playing the family sentiment card with desperate enthusiasm. Helen cried and complained in front of me about how difficult it had been to raise Ryan, how ungrateful we were being, and how unfilial it was to just walk away like this. Victor also set aside his ridiculous pride and began speaking in an almost pleading tone about family unity and similar empty phrases. Their performances struck me as both pathetic and laughable. If they had known it would come to this, why did they behave so badly in the first place? When they were humiliating my daughter with their words, why didn't they remember we were family? When he destroyed my daughter's precious keepsake, why didn't family bonds matter then? Instead of responding to their emotional manipulation, I left the decision to Ryan. This was a test he had to face and pass. This time, Ryan didn't disappoint me. He called a family meeting where he and I sat together on one side, facing his parents, and Jade on the other. "Dad, Mom." Ryan's tone was calm, but carried an authority that couldn't be questioned. "Zoe and Lydia have been treated badly here, and we have to move out. That's not negotiable. However, you are my parents, and supporting you is my responsibility." When his parents heard this, hope flickered in their eyes. But Ryan's next words plunged them back into despair. "Zoe and I have discussed this thoroughly." He reached for a printed document and slid it across to them. "We'll fulfill our obligations through a formal care agreement going forward." "A care agreement?" Victor was confused. "Yes," Ryan nodded, explaining patiently. "We'll provide you with a fixed monthly allowance that will cover your basic living expenses and medical needs. But," he emphasized the word strongly, Beyond that amount, all household utilities, property fees, social obligations, and… His gaze shifted to Jade. Any expenses related to Jade will be your own responsibility. We won't contribute anything additional. This agreement was like a cold business contract, quantifying family relationships with clauses and dollar amounts. It completely overturned the power structure of this household. Previously, Victor had been the head of household and controller, while Ryan and I were the contributors. From the moment this agreement took effect, they would become salaried dependents, whose quality of life would be entirely determined by the amount we chose to provide. The power dynamic had been completely reversed. You're treating us like strangers, Helen was shaking with rage. Mom, I finally spoke, my voice gentle but each word carefully chosen. Dad was the one who called Lydia a stranger and said we were unfamiliar to him. We're simply using the rules you established to guide our relationship with you. You earn respect through your own actions. Family warmth comes from treating each other with dignity, not from blood relations and moral blackmail. His parents were speechless. They had fallen from the top of the power hierarchy and been reduced to employees governed by rules and regulations. This was more humiliating than any argument could have been. But they had no choice. They knew this was the last and only dignified arrangement they could expect from me. Jade's comfortable life was also coming to an end. She was currently in the middle of several dating prospects, one of whom came from a quite well-to-do family. His parents were successful business owners who placed great importance on matching social and economic status. To impress them, Jade had invited her suitor's parents to our house for dinner. Leading up to this event, she had been bragging about her privileged family background, describing her brother as a senior engineer and her sister-in-law as a corporate executive who were both extremely devoted to their elders. On the appointed evening, the other family arrived with expensive gifts, and Victor and Helen were beaming with pleasure. At the dinner table, Jade outdid herself with elaborate stories about our harmonious and prosperous household. Ryan and I had to work late that evening, so we weren't present for this performance. As the wine flowed and everyone relaxed, the visiting mother casually asked, "So you're retired now and living quite comfortably, I imagine?" Victor, having had a few drinks and still nursing resentment about his recent financial limitations, couldn't resist opening up about his troubles. "Comfortable enough, I suppose, but money's a bit tight these days." He sighed dramatically before launching into his complaints. "Young people today just think about themselves once they spread their wings. They don't care whether us old folks live or die." His intention was to gain sympathy by portraying us as unfilial, but the visiting parents were sharp enough to immediately detect problems in his story. "Oh, are Ryan and his wife too busy with work to help with household expenses?" the father asked with carefully neutral interest. "Busy? I think they just want to keep as much distance from us as possible." Victor, with a belly full of wine and nowhere else to vent his frustrations, began spilling family secrets to these strangers. "Now they're holding on to every penny and just giving us a tiny allowance each month. It's like charity for beggars." The atmosphere at the dinner table immediately became uncomfortable. With just a few more questions, the visiting couple extracted the complete truth. This household had previously been supported primarily by the daughter-in-law's income. That daughter-in-law had already purchased her own home and was moving out. That a formal support agreement had been signed limiting the elder's financial resources, and that there was a 30-year-old unemployed daughter who had been dependent on her brother and sister-in-law. The dinner ended awkwardly, with forced smiles and polite but distant farewells. After the guests left, Jade was still lost in fantasies about marrying into wealth and status. The next day, however, the matchmaker called with devastating news. The other family felt that their values were incompatible, and the potential marriage was off. Jade had a complete meltdown. She screamed at Victor, "This is all your fault. I told you not to run your mouth. You ruined everything for me." Victor was bewildered, having no idea that his few complaints would have such serious consequences for his daughter. The father and daughter ended up in a screaming match in the living room. When Ryan told me about this incident later, I felt absolutely nothing. Jade had always built her relationships on lies and pretension, and once the economic foundation supporting those lies was removed, her glamorous facade naturally revealed the ugly reality underneath. Selfish people always end up destroyed by their own selfishness. She was getting exactly what she deserved. Moving day arrived with exceptionally beautiful weather. I hired professional movers, and 4 or 5 efficient workers had all of our belongings packed and transported in less than half a day. The house that had once been filled with our presence suddenly felt empty, strange, and echoing. Victor and Helen sat on their couch, silently watching everything unfold. They didn't try to stop us or curse us as I had expected. They simply observed with poorly concealed sadness and desolation in their eyes. When the last box was loaded onto the truck, the house contained only the elderly couple and their worn furniture. The empty living room felt like a body from which the heart had been removed. I took Lydia's hand, preparing to say our final goodbyes. "Dad, Mum, we're leaving now," I said simply. Helen's eyes immediately filled with tears, and she stood up as if she wanted to say something, but only her lips moved soundlessly. Victor, this man who had been stubborn his entire life, also rose to his feet. Looking at me with a hoarse voice, he said, "Zoe, before, we were wrong." This was the first time in the 4 years I had been part of the Hall family that I heard the words, "were wrong," from his mouth. His gaze moved past me to settle on Lydia, who was standing behind me. A smile that looked more painful than crying spread across his weathered face as he took a step in her direction. He seemed to want to reach out, to touch his granddaughter's head, the way a real grandfather should have done all along. Lydia instinctively moved closer to me, her small hand clutching my clothes tightly. She looked at this grandfather who had broken her most precious possession, and her young face showed not hatred, but a kind of clear, childlike distance. "Grandpa, it's okay," she said in a small but distinct voice. "Mommy says we should stay with people who like us." Children speak without filters, but their words can be the most cutting of all. Victor's outstretched hand froze in mid-air. His body shuddered as if he had been struck, and the colour drained completely from his face. Lydia's innocent statement pierced through all his defences like the sharpest blade, reaching the deepest part of his heart where his regret lived. He stood frozen, and for the first time, his cloudy old eyes clearly reflected the word remorse. I didn't say another word. Taking Lydia's hand, I turned and walked out of this house where I had given everything but received only pain in return. The sunlight outside was warm and bright. I knew that my daughters and my new beginning was just starting. 6 months later, the balcony of our new home was filled with succulent plants that Lydia and I had grown together. Winter sunlight streamed through clean glass windows, casting warm, golden patches on our floor. Lydia sat on the carpet with Ryan, assembling an enormous Lego castle, their laughter ringing like wind chimes. Ryan had transformed completely. He was no longer the wishy-washy people-pleaser caught between conflicting loyalties, but had become a responsible husband and father. He helped Lydia with her homework, read her bedtime stories, and prepared hot, delicious meals for me when I worked late. Our small home was filled with the quiet, genuine happiness I had craved throughout those 4 difficult years. The day before Thanksgiving, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end was both familiar and strange. It was Victor, but his tone no longer carried its former arrogance and self-righteousness. Instead, it was careful, almost pleading, and respectful. Is this Zoe? It's me. Oh, well, Thanksgiving is coming up, and I was wondering when you might have time to come home for a visit. He used the word home. I didn't respond immediately. The silence on the other end seemed nervous, and after a pause, he quickly added, I wanted to ask Lydia. His voice became even quieter, tinged with unmistakable anxiety. My dear granddaughter, what would she like for Thanksgiving this year? Grandpa wants to get something special ready for her. From that child to my dear granddaughter. Between those two phrases lay a war, 6 months of separation, and perhaps his genuine, if belated, remorse. I turned to look out at the brilliant sunshine streaming through our windows, then at my daughter and husband laughing together in our living room. I smiled. It was a smile that came from deep in my heart, one of complete peace and resolution. Respect and family love cannot be demanded through blood relations. They must be earned, bit by bit, through one's own actions. I had won this war. I had won back my dignity, my daughter's well-being, and our new life. Dad, I said into the phone, my voice calm and warm, we'll check our schedule and come visit when we can. After hanging up, I could almost see the relief on that old man's face. A new relationship was beginning to form, exactly as I had hoped it would. Perhaps this was the best possible ending after all.